The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as preparations began for the annual Children's Charity Gala. Princess Charlotte, now 8 years old, stood nervously beside her governess, adjusting the small tiara that sat delicately on her brown curls. This was to be her first major public appearance without her parents, Prince William and Catherine, who were attending a state dinner in Scotland. Charlotte had practiced her speech dozens of times, each word carefully chosen to inspire donations for the Children's Hospital. Her small hands trembled slightly as she held the index cards, but her eyes sparkled with determination. She wanted to make her parents proud and show everyone that she could handle royal duties with grace, just like her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. Camilla, the Queen Consort, arrived at the venue in a burgundy Rolls-Royce, stepping out in an elegant cream-colored dress adorned with pearls. Her presence commanded immediate attention from the gathered crowd and media. She had been looking forward to this event, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate her growing influence within the royal family hierarchy. As Charlotte made her way through the receiving line, greeting various dignitaries and charity representatives, she could feel Camilla's eyes following her every move. The young princess had always sensed a certain coolness from her step-grandmother, but today, something felt different. There was an edge to Camilla's smile that made Charlotte's stomach flutter with unease. The venue, a grand ballroom within Windsor's state apartments, was filled with Britain's most prominent philanthropists, celebrities, and media personalities. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the assembled guests, while servants in crisp white uniforms moved silently between tables, ensuring every detail was perfect. Among the security detail stood Sergeant James Morrison, a decorated royal protection officer who had served the family for over 15 years. He had watched Charlotte grow from a toddling infant into the poised young lady she was becoming. His weathered face, marked by years of military service, carried the wisdom of someone who had seen the best and worst of human nature. Morrison took his duty to protect the royal family seriously, not just from physical threats, but from anything that might harm their dignity or well-being. As the formal program began, Charlotte was introduced to deliver her prepared remarks about the importance of supporting sick children. She approached the podium with careful steps, her small frame dwarfed by the grand surroundings. The microphone had been adjusted to her height, and a small step stool ensured she could reach it comfortably. Charlotte began speaking, her young voice clear and sincere, as she shared stories about the children she had met during hospital visits. She spoke of a boy named Tommy, who loved dinosaurs despite his illness, and a girl named Sarah, who painted beautiful pictures from her hospital bed. The audience was captivated by her genuine compassion and natural speaking ability. However, as Charlotte continued her speech, she stumbled slightly over a particularly difficult word. It was barely noticeable, the kind of small mistake any child might make when nervous. But from her position at the head table, Camilla's expression shifted. Her lips pursed in disapproval, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with one of her ladies-in-waiting. Sergeant Morrison, positioned near the stage, noticed this interaction immediately. His trained eyes caught the subtle shift in Camilla's demeanor, the way she seemed to be preparing for something. Years of reading people and situations had honed his instincts, and something about this moment felt wrong. Charlotte finished her speech to warm applause, curtsying gracefully before stepping down from the podium. She felt proud of herself, despite the minor stumble, and looked forward to the rest of the event. The charity auction was about to begin, with various royal memorabilia and experiences being offered to raise funds. As Charlotte mingled with guests during the reception that followed, accepting compliments on her speech and asking thoughtful questions about their charitable work, Camilla began making her own rounds. However, rather than focusing on the charity's mission, she seemed more interested in engaging certain members of the press and influential attendees in hushed conversations. Morrison observed these interactions with growing concern. He could see Camilla gesturing subtly toward Charlotte, her voice too low for him to hear the specific words, but her tone and body language suggested she was being critical. Several times, he noticed recipients of these conversations glancing over at Charlotte with what appeared to be newfound scrutiny. The young princess, unaware of these whispered exchanges, continued to fulfill her duties with the enthusiasm and sincerity that had endeared her to the public. She posed for photographs with charity beneficiaries, signed autographs for children who had been invited as special guests, and listened intently to stories from hospital staff about their work. During the formal dinner portion of the evening, Charlotte was seated at the children's table, as was traditional for such events. This placement was meant to make her feel comfortable while still maintaining her visible presence at the gathering. However, this also meant she was somewhat isolated from the adult conversations happening at the main tables. It was during this dinner that Camilla made her move. Rising gracefully from her seat at the head table, she called for the attention of the assembled guests. Her voice carried easily through the ballroom as she began what appeared to be an impromptu address about royal duty and the importance of setting proper examples. Morrison felt his muscles tense as he recognized the calculated nature of Camilla's words. She was building toward something, and every instinct he had developed over years of protection work told him that Charlotte was about to become the target. He positioned himself closer to the children's table, his hand instinctively moving toward his communication device. The other protection officers in the room seemed unaware of the developing situation, focused as they were on external security threats. But Morrison understood that sometimes the greatest dangers to the royal family came from within their own circles, from those who might use public platforms to settle private scores or advance their own positions. As Camilla continued speaking, her words began to take on a sharper edge. She spoke about the need for young royals to demonstrate unwavering excellence in their public appearances, about how even small mistakes could reflect poorly on the entire institution of the monarchy. Her eyes kept drifting toward Charlotte's table, making her intended target increasingly clear to those paying close attention. Charlotte, still innocently enjoying her dinner and chatting with the other children at her table, remained unaware of the storm that was about to break over her head. She laughed at something one of the hospital patients had said, her genuine joy creating a stark contrast to the tension building in other parts of the room. The atmosphere in the ballroom grew increasingly tense as Camilla's speech took a more pointed turn. Her voice, which had begun with the warm tones expected at a charity gala, now carried an unmistakable edge of criticism. She gestured elegantly with her gloved hands, but her words were becoming surgical in their precision. Excellence in public service requires more than good intentions, Camilla continued, her gaze now directly fixed on Charlotte's table. It demands flawless execution, proper preparation, and the maturity to handle the weight of royal responsibility without faltering. Several guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as the true direction of her remarks became apparent. The charity organizers looked puzzled, unsure whether they should intervene or allow the queen consort to continue. This was supposed to be a celebration of charitable giving, not a critique of royal performance. Charlotte, still seated at the children's table, gradually became aware that something had changed in the room's atmosphere. The other children seemed to sense it too, their animated conversations dying down as they noticed the adults' attention was focused elsewhere. Charlotte turned in her chair to see what was happening, her innocent face showing confusion as she realized that many eyes were now on her. Sergeant Morrison felt his jaw clench as he watched the scene unfold. In all his years of royal protection, he had never witnessed such a deliberate and public humiliation of a child member of the royal family. His radio crackled softly with routine security updates, but his full attention was on Camilla and the devastating effect her words were having on the gathering. When we observe young members of our family struggling with basic public speaking, Camilla continued, her tone now unmistakably condescending, we must ask ourselves whether we are doing them a disservice by placing them in situations beyond their current capabilities. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the implication of her words hit home. Several prominent journalists in attendance began discreetly reaching for their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern royal protocol. The unofficial rule of protecting royal children from public criticism, especially from within their own family, was being shattered before their eyes. Charlotte's governess, sitting nearby, looked stricken. She had been responsible for Charlotte's preparation for this event, and felt a wave of protective anger at seeing her young charge being criticized so publicly. However, royal protocol prevented her from speaking out against the queen consort, leaving her feeling helpless and frustrated. Morrison watched as Charlotte's expression changed from confusion to understanding, and then to something that broke his heart, a look of hurt and embarrassment that no child should have to experience in such a public forum. The young princess's earlier confidence and joy had evaporated, replaced by the terrible realization that she was being criticized in front of hundreds of influential people. Perhaps, Camilla continued, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned with the impact of her words, we should reconsider our approach to introducing young royals to public life. Clearly, some require more time and training before they can meet the standards expected of the House of Windsor. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the waitstaff had stopped their movements, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Charlotte's small hands were now clenched in her lap, and Morrison could see tears beginning to form in her eyes despite her brave attempts to maintain her composure. It was at this moment that Morrison made a decision that would change the trajectory of his career and possibly his life. Royal protection officers were trained to remain invisible, to blend into the background while vigilantly watching for threats. They were never supposed to insert themselves into family dynamics or public statements. But watching an 8-year-old child being humiliated by someone who should have been protecting and nurturing her triggered something in Morrison that transcended his professional training. He stepped forward, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure as he moved toward the center of the room. His military bearing and the authority that came with years of service commanded immediate attention. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as guests turned to see what the protection officer was doing. "Your Majesty," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, using the formal address that protocol demanded, while his tone carried undertones that suggested this was far from a routine security matter. "I believe there may be a misunderstanding about the events of this evening." Camilla turned toward him, her expression showing surprise and displeasure at being interrupted by security personnel. She was not accustomed to having her public statements challenged, particularly by someone whose role was supposed to be purely protective and silent. "Sergeant Morrison, I believe," she said coolly, recognizing him from previous royal events. "I'm sure whatever security concern you have can wait until after my remarks." But Morrison stood his ground. His years of military service and genuine concern for Charlotte, giving him a courage that surprised even himself. "Ma'am, with respect, I believe the security of all members of the royal family includes protecting them from unnecessary public criticism, particularly when it involves children who have performed their duties admirably." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. Royal protection officers simply did not challenge senior royals in public forums. The breach of protocol was unprecedented, but Morrison felt that protecting Charlotte's dignity was more important than following conventional rules. "Princess Charlotte delivered an excellent speech tonight," Morrison continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. She spoke with genuine compassion about sick children, demonstrating exactly the kind of empathy and dedication that the royal family should be known for. Any minor stumbles were simply the natural nervousness of a child taking on adult responsibilities with remarkable grace. Charlotte looked up at Morrison with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. No one had ever defended her so publicly before, and certainly not against criticism from within her own family. The protection officer's words felt like a lifeline in what had become an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Camilla's face flushed slightly. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was difficult to tell. She had not expected her criticism to be challenged so directly, particularly not by someone whose job was supposed to involve silent observation rather than public commentary. "Sergeant, I think you may be overstepping your role," she said, attempting to reassert control over the situation while maintaining the composure expected of her position. "Perhaps, ma'am," Morrison replied evenly. "But I've spent 15 years watching members of this family grow and develop. I've seen Princess Charlotte practice her speech for weeks, worrying about every word because she wanted to help sick children. She succeeded magnificently tonight, and that deserves to be celebrated, not criticized." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. Media representatives were discreetly recording what they could, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would likely make headlines around the world. Morrison's colleagues in the protection detail looked torn between their loyalty to their teammate and their training to avoid such public confrontations. They understood his motivation. having all witnessed Charlotte's dedication and genuine nature over the years. But they also recognized that his career was likely in serious jeopardy. Charlotte herself seemed frozen between wanting to flee the room and staying to see how this defense of her character would play out. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a kind of amazed gratitude that someone was willing to risk everything to stand up for her. The charity organizers looked helpless, caught between their desire to honor the royal family and their growing discomfort with how the evening was unfolding. This was supposed to be a celebration of charitable work, but it had turned into something none of them could have anticipated. As the standoff continued, Morrison realized there was no backing down from the position he had taken. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But as he looked at Charlotte's young face, he felt certain that some lines were worth crossing when the protection of a child's dignity was at stake. The ballroom remained in stunned silence as the confrontation between Sergeant Morrison and Queen Consort Camilla reached its peak. The unprecedented nature of the situation had left even the most experienced royal watchers uncertain about what protocol demanded in such circumstances. Never before had a protection officer publicly challenged a senior royal's treatment of a family member. Morrison could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, but his focus remained on Charlotte, who was looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. The 8-year-old princess seemed to understand, despite her young age, that someone was risking everything to defend her dignity. "Your Majesty," Morrison continued, his voice respectful but unwavering, "Princess Charlotte represented the royal family beautifully tonight. She spoke from the heart about helping sick children, which is exactly what these charitable events should accomplish. I believe the public and the media present tonight would agree that she conducted herself with remarkable poise for someone her age." Several nods from the audience confirmed Morrison's assessment. The charity organizers, emboldened by his words, began to murmur their agreement. Charlotte's speech had indeed been moving and appropriate, her minor stumble insignificant compared to the genuine compassion she had displayed. Camilla found herself in an increasingly difficult position. Morrison's defense of Charlotte was reasonable and difficult to argue against without appearing petty or cruel. The presence of media and influential guests made any continued criticism of the young princess potentially damaging to her own reputation. "I see," Camilla said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Well, Sergeant Morrison, while I appreciate your dedication to your duties, I believe matters of royal protocol and family guidance are perhaps beyond your purview." But Morrison was not finished. Years of witnessing the genuine kindness and dedication of the royal family members he protected had given him deep insights into their characters, and he felt compelled to share what he knew about Charlotte specifically. "Ma'am, if I may, I've had the privilege of observing Princess Charlotte during her private preparations for tonight. She spent hours practicing her speech, not because anyone forced her to, but because she genuinely wanted to help raise money for sick children. She asked thoughtful questions about the hospital's needs, and even suggested using her own pocket money if the fundraising fell short. These details, shared publicly for the first time, painted a picture of Charlotte that resonated powerfully with the audience. Here was a child who embodied the very best of what the royal family could represent: genuine service and compassion, rather than mere duty. Charlotte herself looked surprised that Morrison had noticed these details, but also pleased that someone had recognized her sincere motivations. She had indeed been deeply moved by the stories of sick children, and had approached tonight's event as a real opportunity to help rather than just another royal obligation. The charity's director, Dr. Margaret Henderson, stepped forward at this moment, emboldened by Morrison's courage and feeling a responsibility to support both the princess and the cause they were all supposedly there to support. "If I may add," Dr. Henderson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades working with children, "Princess Charlotte's speech tonight was one of the most heartfelt and effective presentations we've ever had at these events. The pledges we've received this evening have already exceeded our expectations, largely due to her genuine appeal on behalf of our young patients." This intervention from the charity representative added another layer of validation to Morrison's defense. It wasn't just a protection officer's personal opinion anymore. It was a professional assessment from someone whose judgment carried significant weight in charitable circles. The gathered guests began to shift their attention back to Charlotte herself, many of them approaching her table to offer personal congratulations on her speech. The tide of public opinion in the room was clearly turning in favor of the young princess, making any continued criticism from Camilla appear increasingly inappropriate. Morrison could see his fellow protection officers exchanging glances, some supportive, others clearly worried about the precedent he was setting. His radio had been buzzing with messages from Security Command, undoubtedly asking for explanations about the unusual situation developing in the ballroom. Recognizing that the moment had reached a natural conclusion, Morrison made a slight bow toward Camilla and then turned to Charlotte. "Princess, I believe your parents would be extremely proud of how you've conducted yourself tonight. You've honored the royal family, and more importantly, you've genuinely helped children who need our support." Charlotte's face lit up at these words, the earlier hurt beginning to fade as she realized that most people in the room had appreciated her efforts. Several of the hospital patients who had been invited as guests came over to thank her personally, their genuine gratitude providing the kind of validation that no royal protocol could manufacture. Camilla, finding herself increasingly isolated in her criticism, made a strategic decision to gracefully exit the confrontation. "Well," she said with forced lightness, "perhaps we should return our focus to the evening's charitable purposes. After all, helping sick children is what we're all here to accomplish." The suggestion was clearly an attempt to move past the uncomfortable confrontation, but it also represented a tacit acknowledgement that her criticism of Charlotte had been inappropriate. The audience seized on this opportunity to redirect their attention, many making additional pledge commitments in a show of support for both the charity and the princess. As the evening progressed, Morrison found himself surrounded by well-wishers who appreciated his defense of Charlotte. But he also noticed the stern expressions on the faces of several royal household officials. He understood that his actions, while morally justified, would likely have serious professional consequences. Later, as the event concluded and guests began to depart, Charlotte approached Morrison with her governess. The young princess looked up at him with serious eyes that seemed older than her 8 years. "Sergeant Morrison," she said quietly, "thank you for saying those kind things about my speech. I was trying very hard to help the sick children, and it means a lot that you noticed." Morrison knelt down to her level, his expression gentle despite the gravity of the evening's events. "Princess, you did something wonderful tonight. You spoke from your heart about helping others, and that's the most important thing any royal can do." Charlotte nodded solemnly, then surprised him by adding. The innocent concern in her voice reminded everyone present why Morrison's intervention had been necessary. This was a child who deserved protection and encouragement, not public criticism from those who should have been supporting her. As the royal party prepared to depart, Morrison received a message on his radio to report to Security Command immediately following the event's conclusion. He understood that his career with the Royal Protection Service was likely over. But as he watched Charlotte leave the venue with renewed confidence and dignity, he felt certain that some principles were worth the cost. The media coverage of the evening would indeed make headlines around the world, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. Rather than focusing on Charlotte's minor speaking stumble, the story became about the protection officer who stood up for a child's dignity, and the young princess who had touched hearts with her genuine desire to help sick children. In the days that followed, public opinion strongly supported both Morrison's intervention and Charlotte's charitable efforts. The hospital received unprecedented donations, and Charlotte's reputation as a compassionate and dedicated young royal was firmly established. Morrison did face professional consequences for his breach of protocol, but the overwhelming public support for his actions, combined with the recognition that he had acted from the highest motives, ultimately led to a resolution that honored both his service and his principles. The incident became a defining moment for Charlotte, teaching her that standing up for what is right sometimes requires courage, and that genuine service to others is always more important than perfect protocol. It also established her as a royal family member who inspired fierce loyalty from those who served her based on her authentic character rather than her title. For Morrison, The evening represented the culmination of years of dedicated service, and his belief that protecting the royal family meant more than just guarding them from physical threats. Sometimes, the greatest service was defending their dignity and humanity against those who would exploit their positions for personal gain. The Children's Charity Gala would be remembered not for the confrontation that nearly overshadowed it, but for the way it demonstrated the power of genuine compassion and moral courage to triumph over petty criticism and personal ambition.